Um, okay, can you see that and can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, okay, right. So, bit of light relief. This is what I was doing last week. I was, that here is a nuke, and I'd already gone in and felt the weight and had a look at them, and they needed feeding. So here's me trying to stab my veil with scissors. I've got my suit of armor on because it was cold and I was a bit worried about the bees attacking me, but as it turned out, they were fine. But I quite like this kind of nuke. The polystyrene is good because it's well insulated, and that's a feeder on top. So in the autumn, that gets syrup in it, and now just last week I had to give them some food, so I just slide it on and turn that over, and hey presto, I had to shake some bees off. But the feeder can flip upside down, and that gives space for the fondant. And then I went boy with putting the lid back on. This one here is a different type of nuke, but that's the kind I use as a mating nuke. It's called a Mini Plus, and you can winter queens in them, that's one of my nice queens I've got in there. And again, last week I felt the weight and it was very light, so I decided to give them some fondant. But I didn't even want to open them up, so all I did was put it in the feeder like that, and then prized the plastic protector bit off. And I don't know why I'm filming the grass, but very nice grass. And the bees can get at the fondant that way. It was definitely too cold. Well, I thought it was too cold to open it up properly and have a good look. But if they need feeding, they need feeding. And just another one, that was a Langstroth nuke, and I've given them fondant, and you can see they're straight on it, they're all over it. And what I've noticed is when they're hungry, they're quite often all over the top. It can happen with poly anyway because they're quite warm, but yeah, when they're all over the top like that, they're normally quite light. So as winter moves into spring, we should be working according to the weather conditions rather than the date. So just because it's April, I mean, you still get snow in April, so you can't just go by the calendar. But anyway, this is how it normally goes. So in December, I've given them oxalic acid. I don't do anything in January apart from after storms, I wander around to see if I'm still a beekeeper. And one year I wasn't. Well, I think it was in my third year. I had about 6 hives and they all blew over, and I had to start again. So I learned to strap my hives up, and I take a bit more care. And for me, February is similar really. I don't really do anything much, but if it's snowing or whatever, check that the entrances aren't blocked, and occasionally feel the weight. And you never know, if you made a mistake in the autumn and you didn't leave them enough food, then they might need feeding. And it doesn't matter how cold it is. If they need feeding, they need feeding, and put fondant on. It's too early for syrup, but fondant's fine. And then when we get to March, it's basically, I still feel that it's generally a bit cold to actually pull frames out, but it's all about food. So some people jiggle the frames around in the hive a bit. So if there's a cluster and there's some honey frames quite far away from the cluster, some people move them along so that there's a frame of honey actually next to the cluster. Other people wouldn't do that. They would just put fondant on. But the important thing is they've normally got brood at this sort of time, and it can still get cold. So I don't think they're going to leave the brood. So you want food to be easily accessible to the bees. But it's also sometimes sunny, and that you can see them bringing in pollen. At some point in March or April, I changed the floors. It's just a kind of ritual I do. Part of it's just, it's good to have a look at the floor and see what state it's in. Some colonies have a nice clean floor and some don't, and that's something, if you're looking at raising queens and stuff, that might be something to consider. Also, some people put matchsticks or pieces of wood under the crown board to provide ventilation in the winter. I think that's normally a solid floor. If you've got solid floors, some people do that. I think if you've got mesh floors, you probably wouldn't do that, because you end up with a howling gale blowing through your hive. But again, this would be the time to remove them. But as I said, I mean, also because when it's sunny, they are flying and they are bringing in pollen, it's probably a good time to take the mouse guards off, because often mouse guards cause them to lose a bit of their pollen. And this is a year in the life of an average beehive. January through to December, and these orange boxes are what I consider to be the main flows. And this is the number of bees here. So as I say, it's not a huge colony, but this charts the number of bees and also the number of frames of brood. So as you can see, there's quite a big ramp up in brood around about the turn of February, March, and then it really steps up April, May, loads and loads of brood. The point of this is to show you that period there, which is pretty well where we are now, because you've got more brood in the hive, less bees, because the older ones are dying off and the new ones haven't really come along yet. And you still have some cold weather. I mean, we'll probably still have cold weather between now and the end of the month. So it's a dangerous time. So it's just important to make sure they've got food, because as they raise brood, they need the honey to sort of keep themselves warm, and they also need pollen for raising brood. And also, if it depends on what you're aiming for, but some people are aiming for oilseed rape, or they take beehives to pollinate orchards or whatever. And in those cases, they often try and force the bees, force this curve a bit earlier. So what they'll do is they'll feed a bit earlier. They might even feed pollen substitute, just to try and get the bees brooding a bit earlier than they would naturally, to try and get more bees to be able to take advantage of the early flow. I don't do that, but I know people who do. In my opinion, for me, this first flow is just to get them nice and strong, and then it's the summer flow that I'll get my main honey crop off, I hope. So opening up, so this Tai Chi reference, that was something that Randy Oliver, who you may have heard of, he told me about this, and I've watched him inspect bees, and he moves like a Tai Chi master. You know, he doesn't do any sudden movements. Everything's gentle and relaxed, and obviously that helps to keep the bees calm. But you need to get your smoker going, and then a little tiny wisp or two of smoke at the entrance, and then gently open up. Now, if you haven't opened up since last year, then whether it's a feeder or a crown board, it's pretty well welded on. And if you just stick your hive tool in and just pop it, that's a good way to annoy bees. So what I try and do is do it as gently as possible, and I sort of press down, so you can see this hand just above where the hive tool goes in. If you sort of press down with your hand at the same time as gently prising it, then hopefully you can sort of not make too much of a disturbance, and then gently lift off the cover board. And this is something that Randy Oliver was talking about. He says, forget about going smoke free. Proper light use of smoke is a good tool for the beekeeper, and you only need to use a little, but you just needed to use it at the right time. And one of the things he said, which I thought was quite funny, and here's a photo of them. He said, if they're looking at you, then they know you're there. So sometimes when you open up, you can see all these bees lined up along the frame, sort of staring at you. In that case, probably a bit of smoke, and they'll go away. But if they're like that and you stick your hand across, you might get a sting. And then for the actual proper going in, pulling out frames inspection, it's kind of t-shirt weather, 15 degrees, that sort of thing, which I think is probably April time. And clues to look for, it's already been mentioned, but are they flying and bringing in pollen? The one hive in the apiary that isn't flying, I kind of leave that to the end, because that's probably dead or there's something wrong, and I kind of leave the ones that look dodgy till the end. Also, if you leave a feeder on like I do, so you feed syrup with a top feeder in the autumn, and if you leave it on, when you check in the spring, you'd expect it to be empty, because they very quickly guzzle down their syrup and store it and use it, well, keep it over the winter and use it in the spring. I found last week one of my hives had most of the syrup left in the feeder, and that's nearly always a bad sign. And so I had a look, and it was a pathetic 2 frames of bees, not looking too good colony. So that's a sign. And also, if you change the floor, sometimes you get a really disgusting floor, moldy, wet, dead bees. That's not necessarily a good sign, nor is a bad smell. But what I do, everyone's different. Oh, okay. So I always look at the number of bees, and colonies are different. So this is in the November, so it's a tight cluster, but in spring they're probably much more spread out. But I mean, a strong colony could be there could be more or less a box full of bees. That's unusual, but it can happen. Or it can be a really weak colony with just one frame of bees. And so it's just something to take note of straight away. Checking for stores. Quite often a bigger colony will have less stores, less honey stored. So that might need attention. Looking for brood in all stages. So that's eggs, larvae, and pupae. It's good to be able to see eggs. I know some people struggle, but if you can see eggs, you know you've got well, normally you've got a laying queen. I suppose if you've had multiple eggs in a cell, it could be laying workers, but Graham's already covered disease. Space is another thing. There's this kind of relationship between the space and the stores. So if you need to just bear that in mind. And also, if you do find the queen, and if it's a warm day and you've got a bit of time, you're going to find the queen much more easily now than in the middle of kind of July when there's lots more bees. And it's quite interesting. Sometimes you think you've got a blue dot queen, and then you open up and you haven't got a blue dot queen. It's got no dot on because they superseded, or maybe they just rubbed the blue dot off. But it can be a time, if it's a warm day, to mark the queen if she's not marked, and clip her wing if that's what you like to do. And what I do, these arrows, what I found, if I stick the Hive tool just in, for a start, this first frame I don't touch because that's the one that's really like wedged in there with propolis. So I normally take this frame out first. But if you just stick your Hive tool in and lift, I find that quite often the frame just disintegrates and you just pull the top bar out because it's very stuck in there. So what I do is just go where these Hoffman spaces are and stick the Hive tool down there and open it up, you know, all four corners, and then I can get that frame out, and then I've got space to shove the other frames along and have a look. And all I'm really looking for on the first inspection is basically, you know, do they need space? Do they need food? And is there a laying queen? And is everything looking okay? So if you've got a tiny colony, small colony, options, what you could do is if it's healthy but just small, you might want to just combine it with a bigger colony. I just tend to get rid of them. For me, if it's a small colony, something's not, to me, I just think something's not right. And that, as Graham says, you can't always see disease. Like I think viruses and stuff, maybe there's something wrong there. I don't know. Maybe there's something wrong with the queen. To me, if it's a small colony, I just think, well, I'll shake it out and clean up the hive and you know, concentrate my energies on the better bees. But you could combine it, or you could even move it into a nuke and sort of nurse it if that was what you wanted. Graham's done the disease. So on the stores, as I said before, if you were pushing them and once it's got warm, you could feed syrup instead of fondant. And the thing about pollen supplement, we don't really need that. There's loads of pollen, but if it's raining, they can't get it. So people who are pushing their bees to brood early, to catch the early flow, they'll put pollen supplement on because at least it's there and available to the bees at all times. And another thing that some people do is they'll have brood frames full of honey just stored that they've got spare, and that sometimes if a colony doesn't have much stores, you can just pop them in. But again, as Graham was saying, there's always the risk of disease transfer whenever you move frames from one colony to another, or from your store to a hive. And the space thing, if your colonies were fine and healthy, what's going to happen is in an apiary, you've got a couple of colonies that are massive, then the rest of the colonies sort of average, and then one or two that are a bit small. And if they were all healthy, then you could, and people do, especially commercial beekeepers, do this equalization thing. So what you're doing is equalizing the stores and equalizing the bees. So what you can do is take a couple of frames of bees and brood from a really strong colony, give it to a weak colony, and you could take some of the stores of honey from the weak colony and give it to the strong colony. You can see the potential for moving disease around and what have you, but that's a kind of common practice with commercial beekeeping because they want their hives to be very similar throughout the whole apiary, because it makes it much easier to work because they're all going to be at the same stage. If you're on double brood, which I often am, what will happen is that by the time it gets to about April, the bees are all in the top box. So you can just flip them around, put the top box on the floor, put the bottom box on top. and hey presto, they've got lots of space to grow into. Failing that, you can give them a super if they need it. So if you've got a big colony and it needs space, they need a super. But at this time of the year, it needs to be drawn comb. There's no point giving them a super of foundation. So that's drawn comb is a very valuable thing. Some people go into the winter with a super on the floor. That would be what I sometimes do that if you've got it's not properly capped, it's kind of like half capped, half not, and it's not really ready to extract. You can kind of put that on the floor underneath the brood box in the autumn. Bees will take it up into the brood box and store it, and that will be helpful to them in the winter. So when you come to spring, you need to get that super off the floor and stick it above the brood box over a queen excluder. And also some people will winter with a brood box and then a super of honey on top, which is fine because honey is good food for bees. But what will happen in the spring is that they'll have moved up into that super and the queen will have laid and there'll be brood in it, which is not really a problem. You just need to get the queen down into the brood box, which you can do. If you confine her, you can just pick her up and put her there, or you can just shake the bees down into the brood box so that the super's empty. Queen excluder and then the super back on top. And in 3 weeks' time, there'll be no brood in that super. Whether or not you continue to use the super that had brood in it for honey is up to you. I wouldn't have a problem with it, but some people don't like to do that. And then at the same time as doing all this, you can, as I said, you can mark and clip the queen. If it's a drone layer, kill it. And if it's just a horrible, well, in my case, if it's just a tiny little colony that's struggling, I'll just shake them out. And also, it's a great time to look at the brood pattern, the structure of the nest that they're creating. So if it's a nice, neat, circle of sealed brood, circle of open brood, surrounded by pollen and then by honey, that's what you want to see. If you see something else, the pepper pot brood pattern or drone comb or whatever, then that's a problem. So it's a good time to just quickly assess that. Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so that's me done.